Disputed Libyan Prime Minister Ahmed Maytag says he is stepping down to comply with the Supreme Court ruling that his election was unconstitutional. Libya's parliament, where the chaotic vote took place last month, also said it would respect the Monday's ruling. Since the vote in May, Libya has had two prime ministers, as Abdullah Al-Thani has not ceded power. 3 years after Muammar Gaddafi was ousted, Libya remains engulfed by chaos. Mr. Maytag on Monday said he would be the first to comply with the rulings of the judiciary. His rival, Mr. Thani, said he would step down in April following an attack on his family. However, he has refused to recognize the election of Mr. Maytag because of the circumstances of the vote. Elections are now due on 25th of June to replace the Interim General National Congress, which has been acting as a parliament. VOA's Elizabeth Ara joins me now to talk more on this matter. Now, Elizabeth, welcome to Network Africa.
Well, thanks so much, Adeshua, for having me on the program.
You have lived in Libya through the civil war, and you've been monitoring the transition process. It's been 3 years since the ousting of Muammar Gaddafi, and Libya has been ungovernable. How come?
I guess there are several reasons for that. The first is that Gaddafi was such a total autocrat that when he was gone, there was very little in the way of institutions that could serve as some kind of transitional infrastructure. So the rebels basically had to start from scratch. And during this time, when they've been trying to rebuild the country, these tremendous divisions that had been largely quashed under Gaddafi, regional, tribal extremists, started to come out. And making everything all the more difficult is that during the NATO intervention in Libya's civil war, other countries gave a lot of arms to the rebels, and they also got them from government stockpiles. And now the number of militias is just out of control. There have been attempts at disarmament, but they haven't worked.
Now, what do you make of the court ruling on newly elected Prime Minister, Mr. Maytag, declaring his election unconstitutional?
Well, I think that's one of the more amazing parts of that court ruling is that Matik accepted it. I mean, he stepped down. Things have been so chaotic with votes of no confidence, accusations of manipulation. I mean, they had armed men storming parliament. That this kind of by-the-book move has been surprisingly regular.
Well, there are reports also that one of the reasons why Mr. Maytag may have accepted the ruling of the Supreme Court is because a stronghold militia group controlling one of Libya's oil ports will not consent to dialogue with him, creating more tensions in the country. What can you tell us?
Well, Nadeshua, that could well be the main motivating factor here. The group holding the oil hub in the east has pretty much shut it down, which has been a huge blow to the country's finances. And without that getting reopened, the slim chance of putting the country back on track would really be at risk. So when it comes to money, at least, it does appear that the various politicians can work together to make a decision that would help the country.
The interim government appeared to have failed in its primary assignment of constituting a new government. What do you think the way forward is?
Well, the United Nations is hoping to help out. Next week, the UN envoy is trying to put together a political dialogue that would bring together representatives from about 50 different groups, militia leaders, the government, women's groups, civil society groups, to help pave the way toward parliamentary elections set for the end of the month. This is critical, of course, not just for Libya, but really the whole region. I mean, we've seen the fallout from the chaos in Libya in the transfer of arms and fighters to Syria, and of course arms elsewhere in Africa, Niger, Mali, to Boko Haram fighters. So there's a lot at stake in trying to stabilize things there.
Well, thank you so much, Lizzie. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program.
Well, it's good to join you, Adeshua.
Rape has been a weapon of war over the years, but now activism against the devious act is gaining momentum as women register their displeasure over the trend that still rears its head in the 21st century. The ongoing War Rape Summit in London is one out of many efforts to correct the anomaly, an initiative of Hollywood actress and UN Ambassador Angelina Jolie, supported by UK Foreign Secretary William Hague. The UN had earlier warned that rape is on the increase in conflict zones in Africa, like Sudan, Kenya, DR Congo, among others. Every year, about 150 million girls and women are raped in conflicts around the world.
We believe the time has come to end the use of rape in war, once and for all, and we believe it can be done. We're convinced this is an issue of international peace and security, that is central to conflict prevention, that it is fundamental to the advancement of women's rights everywhere, and above all, that it is a moral issue for our generation.
This whole subject has been taboo for far too long. War zone rape is a crime that thrives on silence and denial. The stigma harms survivors, and it causes feelings of shame and worthlessness. It feeds ignorance, such as the notion that rape has anything to do with normal sexual impulses. But most of all, it allows the rapists to get away with it. They feel above the law because the law rarely touches them and society tolerates them. As Eleanor Roosevelt once said, the destiny of human rights is in the hands of all our citizens and all our communities. And this evil will continue ruining the lives of millions of people unless we make this summit a turning point.
Earlier, I spoke with Dr. Princess Kayode Olufemi, a criminal justice psychologist and sexual violence trauma manager. Well, she tells me women and children are always the weak link of any conflict. Are you confident that this conference will help checkmate the use of rape as a war weapon in conflict zones?
I won't say that they can checkmate or they will be able to sit down in a hall, in a summit and determine that no more war. Rape is no longer going to be a tool of war. But I think there's much more about deliberations and seeing how we can make sure we all agree that we would leave women and children out and rape will no longer be a tool, a weapon of war. I think that's basically how it's been looked at. They're looking at shifting, attitudes. They're looking at seeing how to support survivors because there's no way it will still happen. So those that it happened to, but the issue there is basically to see how to reduce it to the barest minimum, that there won't be so much, there's so much pain, so much destruction, so much damage when you look at any war zone and it is the women. We're talking about numbers, nearly 200,000 women in Rwanda in 3 months. 66,000 women in Sierra Leone, about 14,000 women in Liberia. And it's ongoing, that's just Africa. Just look at in Congo, there were about 20,000 women that it happened to. And for Rwanda, I think about 120,000 men were actually accused perpetrators when they were looking at the justice aspect of it. But the point there is, do we need to wait to make sure 200,000 women are affected in a small community? So when you want to talk about a larger war, what really happens? So it's a sitting down together to say, see, let us all agree together to make sure that we do make sure that our women are safe, even in war. And that is a real big twist.
What do you think should be the ultimate punishment for a rapist?
I'm also a survivor of sexual violence. And I know what I've gone through in my life, with the different phases I've faced. But at a particular point in time, you really want them to be punished. And at a point in time, you want to look back and say, how am I making my life? Am I better off at the end of the day in terms of moving on and developing my life and understanding that that person is the one who really has a problem and not me? He has a problem. And the way society also views victims, when it happens, society blames the victims instead of actually blaming those who could not control themselves. And so it's a huge, to look at and say, let them have life imprisonment, or to say, okay, let them go for the death penalty. It's quite difficult to determine which way exactly it should go. When it happens to you at first, of course, that's your first thought is, let him die. And so to say, let them die is vengeance. To say, oh, life imprisonment, just lock him up forever. It's also from the point of pain. But by the time you settle back and you're able to go through therapy and sit down, you find mostly.
So therapy is what you recommend?
It's important. It's important for society not to blame victims. It's important for us to know that they need to go through psychological and psychosocial support, which is basically counseling, therapy. And like I said, it's individual. Some could go for a long time and some may not really go for a long time, and they're back and they'll be able to gain their lives back and accept and move on.
Thanks a lot for sharing your thoughts on Network Africa.
Thank you so much, too.
Thank you. Finally on the program, the spirit of the game of football has taken charge of fans around the world, even as cities come alive as the World Cup begins in Brazil. Well, even though the host nation has been under immense pressure from its citizens for spending so much on hosting the World Cup, protesters appear calm at the last minute as discontent gives way to football camaraderie. So, what are the chances for African nations this year, seeing the closest any African country has been to winning the trophy is getting to the quarterfinals? And that happened with Cameroon and Senegal in 1990 and 2002 respectively. But hear what this football legend have to say about Africa at the World Cup this time around.
I hope that an African country will do well, because I think that a lot of African countries have a lot of players who play in the Champions League, play good teams in Europe. So maybe Ghana or Cameroon will do well.
Well, with more African players now playing professional football in Europe and around the world, it is hoped that Africa will indeed get to the home stretch, at least this time around. Well, that's Network Africa this week. Let me know what you think through the address on your screen. Thanks a lot for watching. I am Adeshewa Josh.
A time comes in the life of every race when people are driven by echoes of the past to chart a course for an exalted future. Africa is a blessed threshold, as major actors in the Africa arena plot a renaissance towards common destiny. Let's pedal across the streams of yesterday, through the backstreets of Africa, to the defining roles of policymakers, the political realities of the African nation, balance of power, and the strive to sustain national interest and identity. Join us on Network Africa on Channels Television. Network Africa, the rallying point for the emergence of a new